We do have a good idea what leadership looks like, and I think we do have a reasonable evidence base. Kevin Collins' challenge to us yesterday was so what do we do with that evidence? So if we look at the standards, the national standards principles around Australia, they tell us what we think principals should be able to do and should know. I think that our research, our evaluation shows that there's got a penetration rate of about 70%, so people are pretty comfortable with them. They're pretty sure that they do describe the sort of behaviours and expectations we have of leaders. But we've also done some further work, and I think there are some startling stats I'd like to talk to you about. When we think about building leader capability, and when we think about what our context says, the evidence that the data shows us, we know that only 15% of primary principals and 22% of secondary principals said they were prepared for that role. So even though we know what leaders have got to do, very small percentages felt prepared. We have, let me go further, startling stats. There were only 26% of principals and 34% of primary 34% of secondary deputy principals who plan to be a leader, plan to be a principal in the next 3 years. You know, there's something wrong in Denmark. Only 3% of primary and 4% of secondary principals view the job as attractive to applicants. 3% of primary principals and 4% of secondary principals view the job as attractive to potential applicants, but 96% of principals would choose the role again. So how do we reconcile those pieces of evidence? And I could go on and on. There's more of that. There's more of those. So I think we know what principals should look like. I think there's a whole lot of data that is very conflicting. So we've got the evidence, Kevin, but what the challenge is what do we do with that? How do we make choices about the sort of policy settings and practices that we should be privileging? And so there's a range of things clearly that we're trying to do at AITSL, from the macro to the micro, from the practical to the theoretical. The profiles now describe what the standards look like in increasing levels of sophistication, right through to our latest piece of work that talks about the elements of a very effective professional conversation. So I think that the challenge then is, how do you work out where you're going to put the effort? The challenge for policymakers, for schools and for practitioners, is where do you put the effort, and where is it most effective in relation to outcomes? And one of the things I'm not sure that as a country we've thought much about is that middle tier of leadership. I'm not sure, and it was interesting to hear Jeff raise it this morning, sometimes we use context as a real excuse, I think, for not recognising the commonalities, and also the role of policy and people like us and a number of the system leaders here in terms of influence, when we know that actually spread is most delivered through vertical influence.
Let me just check this with you, because you could argue, and we'll have a conversation this afternoon about some international comparisons, that Australia has put an enormous investment into identifying a principal standard and now into profiles. So in that sense, we've mapped the territory about what we see as being vital to successful leadership. And then we get the stats about to what extent that's enacted, or whether there's confidence about actually undertaking that work, and whether in fact the behaviours are being made manifest. I mean, the question I think we've got here is, let's assume now we've done the policy setting work. Let's argue that in fact states and territories are aware, and they are, you'll say 70% plus penetration. The question about translation into action, the kind of behaviours that you want to see, we are saying here today that it's vital to lifting our game that principals and teacher leaders are actually demonstrating behaviours of a kind that actually uses the evidence, that knows what interventions to use, under what conditions. I'm just, kind of channeling Simon's opening comments about the staff room and what you want. So one of the professional practices of the 5 is to lead learning. Apart from the stats,
Yep.
are you confident that we're getting people more into that space, that they seriously are, as leaders of schools, taking that responsibility and know what to do?
So I can't help myself, I have to go back to some stats.
Right.
So we conduct a 360-degree tool, and that has been undertaken by 2,304 principals in Australia. And what it shows is the elements of the principal standard that they feel and that their raters judge them as most confident in or best performing in, and the ones that they're least well performing in. So to answer your question, Tony, as leaders of learning, the highest score of those 2,000 people through the 360-degree tool was that they do create a student-centred learning environment. So the next one was creating a culture of inclusion, being ethical. So there's a sense, I think, that schools are good places to be, that people are well treated, that kids are privileged. When we go, however, to what they are seen as least capable of, or where their skills are least high, it is, and I think this is a problem, building capacity, managing high standards and accountability, promoting professional learning, inspiring and motivating, and understanding and leading change. So we've got here a culture of inclusion and support without perhaps some of the capabilities that would allow or that would help, sharper-edged leading of learning in the way that Jeff describes. I have to put some caveats around this. The differentials aren't that great.
Right.
And we're doing a bit more work to refine this, but nevertheless the patterns are very clear and they're consistent.
Okay, let me just interrupt the conversation here for a moment. We've got, can I just have an indication of every principal that we have in the room? That is about 10 or more. Can I get a couple of microphones?
I was a principal for 20 years and I got much better at leading learning. So the irony for principalship is that you get the most positive feedback about your work that is least connected to leading learning.
Yeah,
and so it takes great levels of confidence and wisdom to move towards the work that really makes a difference to what every teacher does in their classroom every day.
It's interesting that you spend 4 years learning to be a teacher and you get a piece of paper to be a principal. It is a stark reality that we have not moved much in this area. Education has moved huge leaps and bounds over the last 10 or 15 years pedagogically and change-wise. We've got a lot of principals who have been in the situation where they are in deep, and I will take your point, a 380 is it's like a shuttle sometimes, and really there needs to be reform in this area.
It's more by luck than design, how they're supported to develop their leadership. There are some brilliant programs around Australia, and I really wish that I was in one of those states and sectors. But it's disappointing in today's world where we know what matters and what we need to do and what we need to prepare, that there's still very little. And some of the documents that have come out of AITSL that have been sitting around for a while now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of response to them.
We need to get better at identifying the next group of school leaders. We need to get better at developing the skills in those leaders. We have to get better at selecting the right person to be in the right place in the right context. And then we have to get better at supporting our school leaders in the role. Because the role's changed significantly over the last 5 or 10 years, and I don't think our current practices have kept up with it.
I've been a principal now for 5 years. It's an enormous challenge, but I relish it. And I have surrounded myself with a team of people who are able to do much of the work. So while I might not be recognised by my staff as the leader of learning, around me I have a group of people who are able to take that role, and I am active in their work and informing their work and being informed about their work. So I don't see my role as isolated or being done on my own, but as part of a team and a group of people, and it's a privilege.
Where we've been able to create leadership density, instructional leaders, where people can get into classrooms, see what teachers are doing, coach, mentor. So the funding is really important, and I would hasten to say that, you know, in the past we haven't had that funding in New South Wales from the Commonwealth, and that's all, you know, had the ramifications of what we're hearing today in terms of some of the data.
Let me ask you this question. Are we seriously making progress? This is the point about tools being around for a while. The National School Improvement Tool, the ACER tool, has been around for a few years now. Now, are we really starting to get a sense in which the nation's school leaders and school system leaders understand that this is absolutely vital work? You should all be using the National School Improvement Tool.
Well, Tony, in 2012, it was only December that the ministers signed up. So we've had a couple of years, really, to implement the National School Improvement Tool. And we're a federation, so every state is able to do what they wish with the tool, and we have autonomous schools. So this is not mandated, this is supported. But the National School Improvement Tool is used in various forms in many places. And if I could express my own opinion, it probably would be easier if we all had the same shared language and we didn't fiddle too much with the tool. It's a little bit like AITSL can present its standards nationally. The National School Improvement Tool is more a choice. It's voluntary.
Right.
But it seems to me that from what we've been doing in our research, it's providing a great structure and language for schools. And I took Bev's point too. It's for leadership teams. So leadership is not even mentioned in the National School Improvement Tool, and it takes me back to work Sara and I did in Victoria. We did some work on signposts, looking at schools that had performed beyond what would be expected by their socioeconomic status. And leadership was implied in all of those behaviours. In the National School Improvement Tool, it's essential in every domain that there's leadership in that area, and it's provided by a team of leaders, led of course usually by a principal, but it's definitely important and necessary, but it's definitely also about behaviour.
So let me ask you this. When the early work in 13-14, Queensland was an early adopter of this work, Northern Territory, that was then customised in Tasmania. It's being used in South Australia. I mean, what's your sense?
ACT,
Yep. So in other words,
independent schools, some Catholic systems. Yep.
Where is the take-up? Is it taking place more at the level of the policy centre, then using regional directors and others to promote this kind of work, or are you cutting straight to the chase and going directly to school principals and to clusters and networks?
All of the above. In fact, in independent sector, it's individual schools, as you would imagine, and we are collecting some research data as well. So while the review process takes place in, say, in Queensland through the government, in independent systems, they may employ ACER, it may be done at school level by the school itself. Catholic dioceses are doing it at the diocesan level. All the evidence is also just going to where the system or the owner of that, but we're doing overarching research into its use. And this is something that you would have thought perhaps would have come in at the time the tool was signed up to, that we should see how is it used and what effect is it having. And I just want to take us back to that point about behaviours. It's not going to show great outcome change straight away. So the tool's being used in different ways in different jurisdictions for a couple of years and a bit longer in Queensland and Northern Territory perhaps. It's going to take some time, but we do need to collect behavioural data. How is it being used? What changes in practice in the schools, at the school level? And then what outcomes do we see? It's going to take ages to do that research properly.
I mean, by the way, can you just get an indication? Those who have used the tool currently are using the tool. Either can we get a lift of hands, like high? Here we are 3 years in, potentially,
Almost, yes.
Yeah, and we've got we've got a world-class school improvement tool as a way of being able to get a judgment about how we are performing, and yet the adoption is still a challenge.
Yes, I'm surprised to see perhaps use is the hard end,
Okay.
Tony. I think there's a lot of awareness, and perhaps we could have a look at the awareness levels. This is what my copy of the National School Improvement Tool looks like. Are people aware of the document?
Can we put an indicator?
Freely available
Great.
from the government and on the ACER website.
Okay.
So there's an awareness.
Yep.
And then there's a need perhaps to use, and it's used in many variations. That's what I was referring to at the beginning. And
let me challenge you on this, because I know that at the moment a couple of systems are rethinking, like Victoria, not looking anywhere in particular, a school improvement model. Yeah? Here is a school improvement model. Just to put you right on the spot there, friend, why is it that Victoria feels that it needs to think about this, and will we have a problem about language?
I think that there is a balance between ownership and what works. I think we probably err too much on the side of local ownership versus what works. The willingness of the profession to, and governments and bureaucracies to accept this is something that works. We need to just take a bit of a back step in our parochialism and shift to something that is common and build a common language across the country.
Just remind us of the domains.
Okay. The first domain is an explicit improvement agenda.
Yep.
Makes good sense. Analysis and discussion of data. Data, not just numbers, please. We've had a lot of numbers today, but remember that data comes in many forms. Targeted use of school resources. Makes sense. An expert teaching team.
Yep.
Systematic curriculum delivery. Differentiated teaching and learning. Effective pedagogical practices. And school community partnerships. And if I could say, no matter how you cut the literature, you could cut into 16 domains, 20 domains, 9 domains. The literature will be reflected in that cut. You could go down to 5 if you wanted to.
Sure.
But the fact is, this is based on extensive literature review in the Western world. And it strikes me that whatever we do in creating frameworks, we don't need to add more domains, really. The literature shows us the effectiveness of schools is based on these areas. And they've got data within them. I went through recently in our research to some of the areas that are strong and some that are weak. And one of the things that is very strong in the area of the explicit agenda is that the leadership teams, when reviewers go in and look at the work that's going on in schools, leadership teams are totally committed to the framework and the improvement agenda. But in the schools that aren't doing so well, that's where it stops.
Yep.
And so it's got to be more articulated. And some schools that are doing really well have found if they mirror the language of the tool in the school language, that also helps with the alignment.
I mean, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation coming off the back of Jeff's presentation, but particularly framed in the way that Matt and Simon began today, was to say we have got tools, we have got frameworks. We've actually got a nationally adopted framework in relation to school improvement, and we've got a ministerially agreed set of standards and standard for the principal. So I guess what the question, Matt, as we go through the day, and I want to hear other people's views in a moment after I make a connection to Sarah's work, is can we call out other tools, other frameworks that are being used that you think need to be more widely shared? Because we're talking today about inserting something we see an urgent need for, a teaching and learning toolkit, yeah? And we've got a school improvement toolkit, and we've got standards. Sarah, let me ask you this, because in the last domain, the relationship between school and community was the focus of the attention of the Mitchell study, which has been published and people have got the first chapter of that, Shared Responsibility for Learning. It started as being the high impact local learning system because the argument was we will never get there i.e. there being fantastic outcomes for all kids without the connection to community. Just give us the headline findings.
10% of young people, never get over the bar throughout their trajectory of schooling. So that's kind of one key statistic. And the other that Jeff talked about was the widening gap between schools that we're seeing in Australia. So we're seeing a real segregation occurring between schools. This is really quite alarming when, for many young people, it's the only choice that they have is to go to a particular school. And if we're seeing that segregation largely based on socioeconomic grounds, the challenge remains. And the third point, and Jeff again raised it, is perhaps some of the incentives that we've been using, and particularly around the school as the individual unit of effectiveness, is probably our weakest link in terms of being able to challenge that 10% and the widening gap. So our view was to not say collaboration is the answer, but to understand how collaboration was a way of actually addressing this disadvantage. So we worked with 3 jurisdictions who generously sponsored this research, so New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria. And we looked at worked very, very closely with 3 settings. So in Victoria, Bev's in Dandenong West and St Anthony's, in South Australia, Parafield Gardens, and in New South Wales, Canley Vale. So we really wanted to get up close to these schools, and our colleagues Tom Bentley and Sian Kazali were the researchers. And we wanted to understand how these schools were using collaboration to build the necessary relationships, to build the necessary capital, to actively reach out, connect resources to lift the learning. And we called it a high-impact local learning system to begin with, so HILS was our fond name for this. So really trying to understand how these schools were creating these local learning systems. And I guess 3 things just to sort of hit the 3 headlines, and then I'm going to put 3 what I think are some of the system challenges for us. So I think 3 of the headlines that we really came out with was that, collaboration seems to be a fluffy word that everybody kind of uses, and it's nice to have. What really came through these sites was the notion of really purposeful collaboration. So the leaders in these schools were very clear about why they were collaborating, for what purpose, who they were collaborating with, what outcomes they were trying to achieve, mobilising the resources to the best effect for their community, not just their students, but their community. And indeed, what they were also doing was building a really clear understanding of the evidence around that. So I'll kind of quickly go through those 3 things. So purposeful collaboration, very, very clear about the learning outcomes and making them very visible. So it wasn't just about literacy and numeracy, and we had a great discussion for those of you at dinner last night about broadening the basics, but making those visible to the whole community, so being very, very clear. We would argue in our report that they also need to be visible at a systems level, so those broader outcomes. And at the moment it would appear that the real visible ones are literacy and numeracy, and the others kind of get buried in the system. And Victoria has just released its report, making creativity and critical thinking visible. Really exciting, making creative learning visible. So we're starting to sort of see policy doing that. But also creating broad and flexible learning pathways for the students. So that's kind of why. To what end is the purposeful collaboration? And then secondly, really being clear about in what context, who are the partners that are going to really help build that learning outcome. And so they're business partners. We're seeing great examples in Gippsland of schools connecting with industry to really build a broad, flexible learning pathway, to build real-world learning, to create those broader, visible learning goals. So it's been quite clear about who and how. In Dandenong West, I'm speaking for you, Bev, but your theory of action was building a really strong relationships with families, helping families in their learning as well, and building a kind of learning framework for families in the community, particularly because a lot of families were newly arrived into Australia. It's co-design, it's really building students at the centre of that, but being very carefully thought through. What you do see in schools where this is not done well is 20 partners knocking at the door of the school with we can help with this, we can help you with that. And this is the case where you can see many schools, with 25, 30 partners, not strategic, not purposeful, and in fact creates more work for the leader in trying to manage all of this. So that's a kind of tension there. And finally, building this collective understanding, this collective understanding of what quality means. So using local data, noticing, so that professional judgment of how students are learning, how students are making progress in these different areas of learning, feeding that back. And so we talked about a lot having a kind of feedback-rich environment that everyone who's part of this collaboration gets to know. So parents, the business, other partners, the schools collectively as they're working in a group, they get to know the improvement. So I think we have got the wrong incentives in place in the system. The incentives are individual schools, individual units, my children in my school, and we're not thinking about children in a community, so a kind of collective responsibility for the children. So, we've been talking a lot about what a collective or what a collaborative incentive system would look like, or an accountability. So incentives drive individual practice. There's no incentive to keep the hardest to teach kids at your school. So they get booted out or they get sort of recycled around schools. So what's the collaborative endeavour to lift? And we've got really good examples in Athalia in Victoria where schools are working together for the interests of all children in that community, and that's cross-sectoral, really exciting. The second system thing is the workforce, and I think Ben will probably talk more about this afternoon, but it's what are we doing as a system to create the professional collaboration across professions, across sites. So what are the platforms that are really allowing that professional collaboration within school, between schools, between professions and in the community? And who actually can lead and drive that? And we think there's a real systems missing piece in the design around that. It seems to be left to individual kind of silos to do that. And finally, it is the evidence piece. So one of the things that I was cheekily asked, well, Sara, what's the size effect of this collaboration? And one of the things we say in this report is that, we don't want to go down this dichotomy of within school, out of school, because if we only focus on the within school variation, we're missing the opportunity to boost the impact of the beyond school variance. And so not thinking it as a dichotomy, but actually thinking, how do you knit those together and get the greatest outcomes? So building the evidence of how effective collaboration works, what quality collaboration means, is a professional judgment, it's a professional conversation. but it's
Yep.
also one that the system needs to build.
Brilliant. I mean, the reason why we want, and Margery, you might want to make a comment, but can I just say, and then I'm going to open this up. The reason why we wanted to insert that study is because it confronts what we mean by the system. So we can have a whole conversation here about a system that in our minds may well be a much more defined system around, as you say, individual sites. That is not the conversation we're having in Australia. Today we're going to have a conversation about the importance of school to school, of networks, of the way in which we think about an ecosystem for learning, and I would have thought actually that Matt and Simon opened that up this morning. So before we start, saying, okay, just take system for granted, we should learn the lessons about what high-performing systems look like now, what you then need to establish in terms of standards and approaches, tools and techniques to be able to get the best out of the system. But Margery?
Maybe it's because at AITSL we're thinking so much about this at the moment, but the conversations that we've had now and Minister Pickley's observation last night, we do know what to do. So why don't we do it? So one of the things that I think is a real challenge for us and for this conference is there is a plethora of tools out there.
Yeah.
We contribute to that.
Yeah.
Ours are fabulous, but they're just one of a lot of stuff. How do we move people from awareness and intention to engagement and behaviour change that's sustained? We know the collaboration's a great answer. You've got a fabulous tool. We have too. I don't know how we help people pick the ones that are going to be most useful, and Simon's dissertation this morning about the reality of a principal having to make decisions in 35 minutes was a real one that has real resonance. So I reckon I just continue to struggle with what is it that would direct a person to a response that they can adopt and adapt, but is closer to the right response for them in the plethora of stuff that's out there.
That's precisely the question. Yeah. In the time that's left before we have a break, can I, just so there's a kind of a change in pace here, can you literally have 5-10 minutes at your table and have a crack at that question? Because we were going to say to ourselves this morning, given those examples, given the embracing of what we might see as being a more sophisticated system, and Rod, you this afternoon are going to talk about the interface between improvement and innovation, how you have to actually transform your notion of the system. But what is it that is preventing us? What are the barriers to actually taking these tools and applying them in highly productive ways?
Well, I was thinking that it would be great to see further, teachers really encouraged to do action research and that become actually part of their professional role, is to research their own practice, their own effectiveness, in partnership, hopefully academic partners from the universities to support that.
So they'll be looking for tools because they've already got a research consciousness. That's the nature of their environment. That's how they go about doing their work.
And it would also help them to evaluate the tools and the evidence that they're presented with.
We were just talking about the business of not just the what, we know a lot of the what, but how do you get buy-in? And we meet a lot with leaders groups, and one of the constant conversations is, I really want teachers to be involved. How do we get buy-in? How do we get people to come to the table and want to do this work? So we were just talking about some of the exploratory work we've been doing in South Australia about using the power of kids to create the buy-in. And so even though teachers are feeling overwhelmed, and we were just talking about a strong compliance agenda and so on, what we found is that when we've got kids giving feedback to teachers, or kids working shoulder to shoulder with teachers to co-design the learning or to co-design the professional development stuff for teachers, or going to other schools to run it, that in fact teacher response has been really amazing, and the sort of engagement's been super fast, and in fact improvement in kids' outcomes has been super fast. So that's a really interesting piece about what does it take to motivate our greatest resource, in a sense, our teachers, who are vocationally oriented. Jeff talked about all those incentives that have had very little impact, but there are some things that have massive impact on teachers and get their buy-in straight away. So how do we become more sophisticated in identifying what that is, and then using the collaborative to harness it and accelerate it?
Looking at the intersection between kind of practice and policy, what's really key is a process. And what we love about this conversation of disciplined innovation, it's not out there saying there's a whole bunch of teachers that are radically disrupting. That's scary when we're talking about kids and what's needed with improving outcomes of kids. What we're talking about is a collective and a collaborative of aspiring leaders, of teachers working alongside students, as Margot was saying, that are identifying challenges within context. They are acting, so they're very quickly moving from thinking and processing to doing, and then we've got something to evaluate in how do we know. We talked a lot about how do we get people engaged in a tool. Great work through Learning Frontiers, some brilliant work that has been emerging through collaborations with schools that are in this room. And they've very quickly been able to act upon a contextual problem, and then they identify the tools that they want to use. And there's a great swag of tools. But to just put these tools in front and expect behaviour change, it's where we've got that why, we've got the what now in these tools, and we do have a collaborative profession and some processes that are really interested in that how. And I'm really interested in how collaborations are going to be informing processes that animate tools and strategies as well.
As a principal or as a school leader, how do you know which tool and how do you take your teachers on that journey? And also, we're probably advocating at this table too that we did need a customisation of tools, but really otherwise you end up with an incoherent kind of system. So in the same way somebody said there are a lot, if you have lots of partnerships, it doesn't work at a school if there are way too many. Same thing if you've got too many different kind of conceptual frameworks or ways of thinking about the work kind of intersecting with each other. And one of the conversations here was about waves of reform. And so how as a principal do you slow it down and get something that aligns to where your school is at this point in time? And also, how does the system actually support you to make those choices? We didn't come up with a solution, but that was definitely the pain point, was actually how do you choose and how do you take your staff on that journey?
And I'm becoming a researcher now because I keep saying we need more research. But actually, this is a point where we need to study more. And interesting, in England, we're running some significant studies asking that very question. We're providing the same evidence to 400 schools, nearly 1 million children, but using 7 different channels of providing the evidence and trying to understand which way do you engage a teacher in evidence actually brings about change in their behaviour. We actually don't know much about this. We default to certain beliefs about it. So there's a question that's the first point. We need to know more about. We need to research the question of change. The second is, I know we do know a lot, but let's not lose sight of the fact that this fantastic inquiry about how people learn is something we need to learn more about in itself. So don't lose sight of the content. We're finding that with the 2,500 schools that are now involved in research studies with us, what engages and motivates the teachers is this endless question of how can I help my children learn more? So content is still part of it. Let's learn more about teaching and learning as well as just implement what we already know. I think yes about that. And then the third, if you think about that in relation to Jeff's really interesting presentation, if you look at those children who he said we find harder to teach, we need to learn more about how do we make those children learn. If you think about the place, I don't know, of technology or character development in children, these are new fantastic areas of inquiry that we need to be engaged in. So I think my reflections are, let's not lose sight of content. We need to keep learning more, but let's apply our belief in evidence as wisdom as part of the solution to the question of how do we develop better process to implement what we know as well.
Brilliant.